We're going to be live with encouraging words in just a few minutes. Well, actually, we're live now, but we're waiting for people to join us. And while we do that, as has been our practice in the past, we talk about various different things. Andy and I were talking as we were getting ready to go on. And I said to him, let's share something maybe a little unusual about ourselves, or something that we've done, or something that we like that a lot of people don't know about us. You see me preaching and teaching. A lot of you haven't spent time with me to know what some of my interests are. So, for example, some of you might be surprised to know that I am a really big fan of airplanes all of my life. I've been interested in space and all the moon launches and moon landings. That's all rockets, and then airplanes, air shows, model airplanes. In fact, I continue to build and fly model airplanes now, and try to get my grandkids involved in that. I've been to various different air museums and rocket museums literally around the world. That might be something kind of odd that you see in me that I wouldn't know about me, that I really like flying too. Whether it's commercial, I look out the window and I like looking at the wing and its movements, and it's when we're landing and taking off, and I like looking out the window and looking at the ground beneath and everything. So everything about flying I like and I enjoy. And so that's something about me. Andy, what are you going to tell us about yourself?
You just brought up a memory though for me. I remember you used to have model airplanes hanging from the ceiling of your bedroom when we come visit you. So that was
Right.
aware of your love of flight for some time. You know, I suppose a lot of people don't know that when Karen and I first got married in the early 80s, we lived out in Washington State, and that was before I was preaching. And before we had children, we had sheep. Not for very long. And it was not a successful venture. We weren't into it for business or profit or anything like that. It was just her parents lived on 5 acres of land, and we were renting from them. And I asked if I could use the pasture. And this one old sheep wandered onto our property one time, and that started it. I kind of adopted him, this big old ram, and then we got some ewes and probably had 4 or 5 at once. And I learned real quickly how hard it is to be a good shepherd. And I wasn't a good shepherd, is what I learned through that process. But it was a short-lived year and a half experience or so. But most people don't know about that.
Oh, that is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't realize that, don't think about the fact that preachers that they see all the time have lived normal lives doing kind of normal things and have interests outside of where you might even expect. So if you're just joining us, we're just chit chatting and talking about some things in the past and some of our interests. I welcome you to Encouraging Words. Really glad that you've joined us, and you're an encouragement to us for joining us. I haven't said for quite a little while that Encouraging Words is on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. And if you miss it, it is streamed it's recorded as well on my personal Facebook page, also on the church's Facebook page for the Westside Aurora Church of Christ. And also, if you go to aurorachurch.com and click on live, not only will you see it live when we're on, but you can also then look at previous episodes by clicking on that, and it'll take you to YouTube. You can watch a bunch in the past. But I really appreciate you joining us. Andy, good to have you here. You doing okay?
Yeah, doing great. Good to be with you. Yeah. So our word for tonight is the word rest. Rest. And for those who are tired, that's a really encouraging word. We all, especially the older we get, the more we enjoy our rest. and look forward to times of rest. We're going to begin from a scriptural point of view, looking at this word. We're going to go right back to the beginning, Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, after he declared everything, all that God had created very good. It says in verse 2, on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So there we see at the end of the creation, God resting. And we shouldn't get, I think sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. Well, if you had created the universe in 6 days, you'd be tired too. God's not tired. It's not a matter of him being tired, exhausted from all of that work, as we would if we had put in 6 days worth of work like that, but that he has completed. He has finished what he set out to do, and he was resting that. And we all know the satisfaction that is found in having completed a task and sitting back and enjoying it, and so that is what God is doing. He is resting from his creative activity there.
And the next time that we run into the idea of resting is in direct association to the Sabbath. Israel has been led out of Egyptian captivity, and as they are still in the wilderness, complaining about not having food, God sends manna to feed them. And in conjunction with that, he reminds them that they are to, on the sixth day, they're supposed to go out and gather twice as much. Remember, they can only gather a day's worth. They have to go out every day. But on the sixth day, they have to gather twice as much, so that on the Sabbath, the seventh day, they will not be doing any work. They won't be going out and gathering. They won't be preparing this food, but they will have this Sabbath unto the Lord. That is kind of looking forward to the time when we get to Exodus chapter 20 with Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments, and then it is codified into the law itself as remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. He goes on to have various different work restrictions that are laid out. And he tells something interesting in verse 11 when he says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So there is something about this rest of God when he created that is woven into the law that causes them to look ahead to a certain rest, to think about this resting, not just because you're tired, but it has some kind of connection to God and what he has planned for man. By the way, if you read on to the book of Exodus, later in the 23rd chapter, the 31st chapter, and other places, not only does it talk more details about this Sabbath, but several other Sabbaths then are also listed. Times when they are to not work, times when they are to instead reflect on various different other spiritual things rather than working. Very interesting that God introduces a rest that is not that is a physical rest, but obviously has some spiritual meaning behind it.
Yeah, significance. And of course, having been freed from their slavery, their bondage in Egypt, where was it that they were headed? As we read in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, they're headed to the promised land, which itself is therefore described as a rest. And there are a number of places that we could go and look at that. I'm going to just Deuteronomy chapter 3 and in verse 20. This is when Moses has brought children of Israel up to the brink of the promised land, and they had defeated those on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Of course, Moses wasn't going to be taking them in, but we're jumping right into the middle of a thought. That's why all that background. Verse 20 says, until the Lord has given rest to your brethren as to you, and they also possess the land which the Lord your God is giving them beyond the Jordan, then each of you may return to his possession. So he's speaking to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, who were going to be permitted to settle on the eastern side, but their responsibility was to help conquer the land and achieve the rest for the whole nation. And so that's how Israel looked at the promised land, as a rest.
And I think that theme continues on down through the book of Deuteronomy as Moses is preparing the people to take the land, this land of rest. That's how they came to look at it later in the 12th chapter. Verse 9, he says, "For as yet you have not come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you, but when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all of your enemies round about, so that you dwell in there safely." He then goes on to talk about the things that they are going to do once they have that land. So it's some things that they have to avoid and not do. So the land promise and then the actual reception of the land starts to become this large picture of the rest that God was promising to mankind. In fact, I would say that some have maybe taken it too far in the sense that they think that the land was the final rest that God was going to provide. And we see that that's not the case, that the reception of the land was preparing them in heart and mind for the rest that God was going to give them. But it's not the final rest. And we know that from the scriptures that we're going to look at now.
Yeah. And I as I recall, the context in which you were just reading talks about the fact that God would designate a place of worship for them when they got in there. And thus we know in hindsight that was Jerusalem. And King David, a few centuries later, is the one who actually conquers that city and sets it up as their capital. And that's where the tabernacle is brought. And that's the place that is designated by God where Israel was to go and to worship and to offer the sacrifices and such like. And so you might recall in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when David wanted to build a permanent temple there, and God told him no, he says, "I'm going to appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them that they may dwell in the place of their own and move no more, nor shall the sons of wickedness oppress them any more as previously. Since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel and have caused you to rest from all your enemies, also the Lord tells you that he will make you a house." God says that to David. "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men." And then he goes, "But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever." And so we're familiar with that promise that God makes to David about the Messiah who would be coming sometime in the future. Yes, it has some application to Solomon, his immediate son, but Israel and the prophets all pointed to the son of David, the Messiah who would come one day. Now, how that all ties together here, we'll see here in just a minute. But one point I want us to take note of is that David, who we all remember as being the author of so many of the Psalms, in Psalm 95. I'm not going to read the entire Psalm. It's a lengthy Psalm, but we'll begin at verse 6 of Psalm 95. If I can get there. "Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. When your fathers tested me, they proved me, though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation and said, it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And so here David uses the history of the children of Israel's rebellion in the wilderness against God to warn the present generation, his generation, to not be like them, to remain faithful so that they too can enter into God's rest. And David, that suggests what you were hinting at here just a minute ago. They're in the promised land. They've conquered Jerusalem, but God has a rest yet for them. And interestingly enough, Israel does not remain faithful despite this warning. And just real quickly, go to the prophet Jeremiah just to make this observation. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16, Jeremiah is, of course, prophesying just before Judah is taken into Babylonian captivity. And they're going into captivity because of their failure to do what Psalm 95 warned them about. And they have been unfaithful. And verse 16 says, thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk in it. And that was the attitude of Judah at that time. And that's why they went into captivity. They were rebelling against God. And so they would not enter God's rest.
And that is a great introduction to Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. Right. Several verses from Psalm 95 are quoted by the Hebrew writer. Verse 11, we'll jump we don't have a lot of time, so we'll jump to verse 11 of chapter 3. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. The Hebrew writer is trying to stress the faithfulness of Jesus, sort of like the faithfulness of Moses. And you might be thinking, but if they were faithful, then how come this great rest of God didn't come upon them as a nation? Because there were people who had hardened their hearts as in the rebellion. That's verse 8. And then as a result, they weren't able to enter. They weren't able to remain in God's rest. And so the warning in verse 12 is, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelieving and departing from the living God. And then he makes a today application. I'm not just talking about the people in the past, but exhort one another daily while it's called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. He's saying, listen, I'm not just talking history here. I'm just talking about them. We sometimes roll our eyes and say, I can't believe after all they saw and all they did, they departed from God. He says, the same thing can happen to you if you're not careful. And so he says, what happened here? Well, he says, I'll tell you what happened. He said, the same thing happened to them that can happen to us. They believed. They were delivered from the slavery of Egypt. That's verses 16 and 17. And then he says, but to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But those who did not believe. Verse 19 of Hebrews 3. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. It's shocking and it is saddening to hear Jeremiah write that when people just straight out said, we're not going to do it. We don't want this. And he's saying, you understand that when we disobey God, whether we say it exactly in those words with our lips, that's what we're saying. We're saying, God, you've offered us a rest. You've offered us an eternal rest in your presence. The end of our labors, just like in Genesis 2 was the end of his labor, the end of our labors we can come to rest in God. He says, but not if history tells us anything, it's that if we do not obey God, then we will not enter his rest.
Yeah, and so that's the point of the Hebrews writer in making that lengthy quote from Psalm 95 earlier there in chapter 3. But as we go into chapter 4, He says, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. And so the point that the Hebrews writer is making is there remains a rest for the children of God. In fact, he says that there in verse 9, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. And all that he says in between verses 1 and 9 there is just basically pointing out it's the Sabbath was a rest, but it wasn't the rest. The promised land that Joshua conquered for the children of Israel was a rest, but it wasn't the rest. And basically his proof of that is Psalm 95, because David, centuries after Joshua conquered the land, wrote that psalm and said, today, don't be like those in the past who weren't able to enter the promised land, the physical promised land. Don't be like them. But while it is called today, you need to remain faithful, as David was just saying, if you hope to enter the rest, because they weren't permitted. And so that's the point that he's making here in the book of Hebrews.
Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest. Hebrews 4, verse 11.
Right.
Lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So none of us are going to accidentally come into this rest. If we've learned anything from history, we learned that, there is this exodus, there's from slavery, there's this remaining faithful to the Lord in obedience. He's saying, the Hebrew writer is saying the same thing must be true of us. And so we are going to have to be diligent to enter into the rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. We think back about what happened, how wonderful it would have been to be delivered, how wonderful it would have been to cross the Red Sea and be fed by manna and then not make it into the land. To make it into the land, to settle the land, and then be taken away from this land of rest because of disobedience. And we kind of shrug our shoulders and we wonder, how can that happen? He's saying the same thing can happen to us. Let me tell you something. Rest is an encouraging word to us because we yearn for it. But it's also an encouraging word because God has promised, because God has assured us there remains a rest for us. No matter how spiritually exhausted we may find ourselves, no matter how difficult diligence to enter into that rest may seem to us, whatever we have to sacrifice and give up, rest is such a powerful, encouraging word that God's saying, okay, you can't rest now, not fully, there's not a complete, full, satisfying rest now. Now is the time for diligence. Now is the time to keep ourselves from falling. Now is the time for obedience. And he's saying, and that rest is what encourages us to keep on keeping on.
Right. And so the Hebrews writer is writing to Christians, trying to encourage them to hold fast and not repeat the mistakes of the past. But what is this rest? Where does this rest come from? Well, remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29. 28 we'll begin with. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What an invitation that Jesus is offering to us. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the rest, all of the kingly, priestly foreshadowing of the Old Testament. He is our rest. He will take us into that eternal rest, and that certainly is encouraging.
Calls us to it, to this eternal rest, that he is our Sabbath. He is our eternal rest in the presence of God. And nothing is more encouraging than that. Thank you, Andy, for helping us take a really kind of maybe a different and very interesting look at the word rest today.
Well, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
Thanks for studying with us.